At 7:20 on a Tuesday morning, my stepdaughter called to tell me my husband had died during the night. Then she told me he'd left everything to her. My husband was sitting 3 feet away, calmly cutting a piece of toast. I remember looking at him and thinking, well, this is going to be an interesting breakfast. Elaine Nicole said, and her voice was so flat it made the whole thing worse. My dad died last night. Frank stopped moving, not dramatically. He just held the knife over his plate and looked at me. I put one finger to my lips. Nicole kept going. He left everything to me. The house, the money, everything. You get nothing. Before I could answer, I heard Brad in the background. Her husband. He gave this little laugh and said, "Finally, you're out." That was the moment something inside me went very still. I pressed the speaker button and set my phone on the kitchen table. Nicole started talking about coming over later that afternoon to secure Dad's property. She said I should probably begin packing because there was no reason to make things harder than they needed to be. Across from me, Frank slowly put down his fork. Nicole, silence. A long one. Then Frank leaned toward the phone. "Before you clean out my house, sweetheart, could I finish my breakfast?" I heard Brad mutter something that sounded like, "What the hell?" Then the call ended. Frank stared at my phone. For maybe 5 seconds, neither one of us said anything. The coffee maker clicked behind me. Somewhere outside, one of our neighbors started a lawnmower, which felt absurdly normal. Finally, Frank said, she sounded disappointed. That hurt him more than the money. I could see it. Frank was 66 then, and retirement had not been especially kind to him. He'd sold his commercial plumbing business 3 years earlier after nearly 4 decades of climbing ladders, crawling under sinks, and coming home with bruises he didn't remember getting. Once he stopped working, the weight came on fast. Almost 30 pounds. His right knee had been replaced and still complained every time the weather changed. His heart had started acting up. One of his medications made him dizzy if he stood too quickly. There were mornings when the man who once hauled water heaters up basement stairs needed me to help pull on his compression socks. He joked about it, mostly. 2 nights before Nicole's call, Frank had chest pain while we were watching the local news. I drove him to IU Health North in Carmel, where they kept him overnight because his heartbeat was irregular. He came home Monday afternoon, tired, annoyed, and convinced the hospital oatmeal had been designed as punishment. That should have been the end of it. But later we learned our neighbor Tom had left Nicole a voicemail after seeing the ambulance. "Your dad had another scare," he'd said. Elaine took him back in. Didn't sound good. Nicole called the hospital that night. She wasn't listed as Frank's medical representative, so nobody gave her much information. By the next morning, Frank had already been discharged. Apparently, she called his old room and was told he wasn't there anymore. What she did not do was call me and ask is Dad okay. She went straight to Dad is dead, and then straight to the inheritance. That part bothered me. Frank pushed his plate away. How does she know what my will says? I already had an answer I didn't want to give him. 3 weeks earlier, I'd walked into Frank's home office and found Nicole crouched beside the lower filing drawer. She stood up too fast. "Oh, hey, what are you looking for? Dad's old insurance paperwork." She smiled like it was nothing. I let it go. For 14 years, I had worked very hard not to become the suspicious second wife. Frank's first wife, Susan, had died of ovarian cancer years before he met me. Nicole had been an adult when we married, and I never tried to replace her mother. For a long time, Nicole and I got along fine. Then Frank retired. His health changed. And Nicole's questions changed with it. How much did Dad get when he sold the company? Did he ever sell that warehouse? Whose name is the house in now? Frank always had an explanation. She's just curious. She worries about me. She's my daughter. So I stopped pushing. That morning, I wished I hadn't. At 8:03, Frank's cell phone rang. His attorney, Martin Keller. Frank answered. "Morning, Martin." There was a pause. Then Frank's face changed. "No, I'm sitting in my kitchen." Another pause. What I watched him straighten in his chair. Martin had received a call that morning from someone claiming Frank had died. Worse, that person had mentioned the date of a will Frank signed 12 years earlier, before he married me. Under that old will, Nicole really had inherited almost everything. When Frank hung up, he looked toward the hallway where his office was. Then at me. She wasn't grieving me. I didn't answer. He swallowed. She was waiting for me. Martin wanted us in his office immediately. Frank stood up, slowly favoring his bad knee. His breakfast sat untouched behind him. And for the first time that morning, I realized Nicole's phone call might not have been the problem. It might have been the mistake that exposed the real one. Martin Keller's office was near Keystone at the crossing, about 20 minutes from our house if traffic behaved. I drove. That mattered more to Frank than he wanted to admit. For most of our marriage, he had driven everywhere. Road trips, dinner, doctor appointments, even the 3 blocks to CVS when I could have walked. He liked being behind the wheel. But after his knee surgery and the dizzy spells from his medication, I had gradually become the driver. That morning, he sat in the passenger seat of his own F-150 staring through the windshield. "You okay?" I asked. "I'm apparently dead, Elaine. I've had better Tuesdays." I smiled, but he didn't. Martin was waiting when we arrived. He was 62, silver-haired, careful with his words, and had handled Frank's business and estate documents for years. He closed his office door and put a thick folder on the conference table. First, he said, "You're obviously alive." Frank looked down at himself. "Good start." Martin almost smiled. Then he opened the folder. The old will was exactly where it should have been. Frank had signed it 12 years earlier before we married. Nicole was the primary beneficiary. There was a charitable gift to Riley Children's Foundation, but most of the estate would have gone directly to her. Frank stared at the pages. "She saw this, I can't prove," that Martin said. But whoever called this morning knew its date. What Nicole apparently did not know was that the document had been replaced 5 years earlier. Frank's current estate and plan was nothing like the old one. I had protection if he died first. I could remain in our home. My retirement money stayed mine. Nicole still inherited a substantial amount, and Frank had created education trusts for his grandchildren. Nobody had cut Nicole out. She simply wasn't getting everything. Frank leaned back. "She thought Elaine would lose the house." Martin folded his hands. "If she believed the old will was still controlling, yes." Frank looked at me. "She thought you'd be packing boxes before my obituary was printed." There wasn't much I could say to that. Then Martin gave us the part we hadn't expected. Nicole and Brad had visited his office 6 months earlier. "Together?" I asked. "Together." They hadn't asked directly about Frank's estate. Martin would never have discussed it with them anyway. Instead, they asked what happened when an aging parent became incapable of handling money. Guardianship, powers of attorney, who could take over accounts, whether an adult child could step in if a spouse was making bad decisions. My stomach tightened. I remembered Thanksgiving. Brad had been standing in our kitchen with a beer while Frank struggled to sign into an account on his phone. Brad laughed and said, "One of these days we're going to have to take those passwords away from you, Frank." Everybody laughed, including me. Sitting in Martin's office, it didn't sound funny anymore. On the drive home, Frank kept defending Nicole. Maybe she had panicked. Maybe Brad had put ideas in her head. Maybe she genuinely believed the worst after hearing about the hospital. Finally, I pulled into Panera because neither of us had eaten much. We sat near the window with soup and coffee. "Frank," I said, "believing you died doesn't explain why she already knew what she planned to do with the house." He stirred his soup without eating it. I immediately regretted saying it so sharply. This was his daughter. I could be furious with her and still understand that he remembered a completely different Nicole, the little girl whose bicycle he ran behind the teenager, whose softball games he never missed, the young woman he sat beside when her mother died. After a while, he said, "Maybe I should call her. For what? Tell her I've made a miraculous recovery." I laughed before I could stop myself. He finally smiled. That was Frank. Even on a terrible day, he could usually find one dry little corner of it that was funny. The smile didn't last long. Nicole and Brad arrived at our house around 4. Nicole came through the door crying. She hugged Frank. "Oh my God, Dad, I'm so sorry. The hospital wouldn't tell me anything. I thought you were gone." Frank stood stiffly in her arms. "You could have called Elaine." Nicole stepped back. "I wasn't thinking." Brad jumped in. We were scared. I almost asked which part frightened him enough to laugh about throwing me out, but I kept my mouth shut. Then the conversation shifted. Slowly at first. Brad mentioned Frank's driving. Nicole brought up the duplicate electric bill Frank had paid several months earlier. Then his medication. then the time he forgot an appointment. Finally, Nicole said, "Dad, we're worried about you." Frank's expression hardened. "About me or my money? Don't do that. I'm asking." Nicole looked at me. "That's exactly what I mean. Ever since Elaine started handling everything, I handled things because your father had knee surgery. You control who talks to him." I actually laughed. "I'm standing right here, Nicole. So is he." She ignored me. "We spoke to an attorney." Frank went quiet. About what Nicole took a breath. Guardianship. The word changed the room. Frank stared at her. "You want a judge to decide whether I can manage my own life? It's not like that." "That sounds exactly like that." Nicole reached toward him. "Dad, I already lost Mom. I'm not going to stand around while somebody else controls everything you built." There it was. 14 years of resentment compressed into one sentence. This wasn't only about money. Some part of Nicole still saw me as the woman who had stepped into a space that belonged to her mother. Maybe fear of losing Frank had turned into fear of losing what he owned. I couldn't tell anymore. They left 20 minutes later. The next morning, someone knocked on our front door. A process server stood on the porch. Frank read the first page twice before sitting down at the kitchen table. Nicole had filed. He rubbed both hands over his face. "She really wants a court to say I can't take care of myself." I sat beside him. Yesterday, Nicole had tried to inherit from a dead man. Now she was trying to take control of a living one. And this time she had paperwork. Rachel Donnelly didn't waste time trying to make us feel better. That was one of the reasons I liked her. She was an elder law attorney in Indianapolis, probably in her early 50s, with reading glasses hanging from a thin chain around her neck, and the kind of calm voice that made you listen. She read Nicole's petition while Frank and I sat across from her. Then she closed the folder. "Don't dismiss this because it sounds insulting," she said. "We take it seriously, answer it carefully, and document everything." Frank shifted in his chair. "I'm not incompetent. I didn't say you were. My daughter did." Rachel nodded. "And now we show the court why she's wrong." The problem was Nicole hadn't filled her petition with obvious lies. That would have been easier. She used facts. Frank had recently been hospitalized for an irregular heartbeat. He'd had knee surgery. His medications had changed several times. He'd forgotten a cardiology appointment the previous winter. There was also the little accident at CVS. Frank had backed his truck into a shopping cart corral. Nobody was hurt. The truck got a scratch. At the time, we laughed about it. Nicole called it evidence of declining judgment. Then there was the duplicate electric bill. Frank had paid it online, forgotten, and paid it again 2 days later. At 40, that would have been called a mistake. At 66, apparently, it belonged in a court filing. Over the next couple of weeks, Rachel had us gather medical records, account statements, and anything else that documented how Frank actually lived. The worst part for him was the cognitive evaluation. I sat nearby while a clinician asked him questions that would have seemed almost insulting under any other circumstances. "What day is it? Where are we?" "Remember these words. Do this subtraction. Explain how you pay your household bills," Frank answered carefully. He did well. When we walked back to the parking lot, I expected him to be relieved. Instead, he stood beside the truck with his hand on the door and stared at the pavement. What I asked, he shook his head. When I was 45, forgetting somebody's name meant I was tired. I waited. At 66, somebody writes it down on a clipboard. That was when I understood what Nicole had really taken from him. It wasn't money, not yet. She had made him self-conscious about being old. Every stiff step, every forgotten password, every time he asked me to drive became something he wondered if other people were noticing. And I wasn't spared either. Nicole's filing suggested I had isolated Frank and influenced him into changing his estate plan. One Thursday afternoon at Kroger, I saw Susan's sister near the produce section. She spotted me. Then she suddenly became very interested in another aisle. A few days later, a woman from church asked me quietly, "How's Frank doing mentally?" I went home furious. Frank was sitting in his recliner watching an Indianapolis Colts replay. I wanted to tell him what had happened. I didn't. He already had enough weighing on him. Then Rachel found the money. Ironically, she found it because Nicole had claimed Frank's finances were becoming disorganized. Rachel went through several years of account activity. The first questionable transfers started around Frank's knee surgery. Back then, he could barely get downstairs. He was taking pain medication, going to physical therapy, and depending on everybody more than he liked. He had given Nicole temporary access to help with bills. I remembered it. At the time, it had seemed completely reasonable. Rachel spread several pages across her desk. There's roughly $187,000 here that concerns me. Frank blinked. What some of it was straightforward. Transfers, payments, money that eventually landed in accounts connected to Brad's contracting business. About $175,000 could be followed with reasonable confidence. Another $12,000 or so had moved through cash withdrawals and transactions that were much harder to explain. I pointed to those. So what happens to that part? Rachel looked at me. We may never be able to prove exactly where every dollar went. But if we know knowing and proving aren't always the same thing. I hated that sentence. Frank barely spoke. 4 years earlier, he had openly loaned Nicole and Brad $85,000 when Brad's company was struggling. That loan wasn't a secret. Frank had even joked that he was becoming the family bank. But this was different. I never gave them another $100,000, he said. Rachel tapped one document. Then we need to talk about this. She turned it toward him. There was Frank's signature at the bottom. I looked at him. He looked at me. Is that yours? Rachel asked. Frank picked up the paper. His face changed. Yes. No hesitation. No accusation of forgery. That's my signature. The document had been signed shortly after his knee surgery. It gave Nicole limited authority to handle certain financial matters while he recovered. Frank read it again, then a third time. What if I told her she could help Brad? He asked. I felt my stomach tighten. Did you? He looked at me. I don't know. That answer frightened him. I could see it immediately. A forged signature would have been simple, someone else would have been the villain, and Frank would have been the victim. But this signature was real. That night, he barely ate dinner. Around 9, I found him sitting on the edge of the guest room bed. He had an old photograph in his hand. Nicole, at maybe 9 years old, missing a front tooth, sitting on Frank's shoulders at the Indiana State Fair. She used to think I could fix anything, he said. I sat beside him. After a while, he said, maybe she remembers something I don't. I wanted to tell him absolutely not. I couldn't. I wasn't there for every conversation between them. And for the first time since this started, I wondered whether we might be wrong about part of it. The next evening, Rachel called. I answered in the kitchen. Elaine. I finished reviewing that authorization. My hand tightened around the phone. Nicole did have authority. I closed my eyes. Then Rachel added, but not for what she did. Rachel asked us to come in the next morning. She had the authorization laid out on her conference table with yellow tabs stuck along the edges. The signature is real, she said, and Nicole did have permission to act for you during your recovery. Frank nodded. We established that, but permission has boundaries. Rachel slid the document toward him. Nicole had been authorized to pay Frank's medical bills, handle household expenses, move money between his own accounts, and take care of certain transactions for his benefit while he recovered from surgery. Rachel tapped one paragraph. What I don't see is permission to finance Brad's company. Frank leaned closer. It isn't there, no. She pulled out another sheet. I also don't see permission to pay their personal credit card contribute toward improvements on their house, or make cash withdrawals unrelated to your expenses. I looked at Frank. He didn't look relieved. That surprised me. For days, he had been terrified that he'd forgotten giving Nicole permission. Now we knew he hadn't, not in any meaningful sense. But the truth was worse in another way. Nicole hadn't forged his trust. She had used it. Frank had handed his daughter a key because he couldn't get around after surgery, and she had quietly started opening doors he never intended her to touch. On the drive home, he said almost nothing. That evening, things finally boiled over between us. He was standing at the kitchen counter looking through old statements when he said, Maybe I still told her she could help Brad once or twice. Frank. I'm saying maybe. We have the paperwork. That doesn't mean we remember every conversation. I put down the dish towel. What do you want me to tell you? I want somebody to tell me what actually happened. I am telling you what I know. He turned toward me. Everybody is telling me what I know. Nicole says I don't remember. Lawyers ask me what I remember. Doctors test what I remember. His voice rose. And now you're doing it. That stung. I'm the one person who isn't. He stopped. I could have told him exactly what he wanted to hear. I could have said you absolutely never gave her permission. But I didn't know that. And after 14 years of marriage, I wasn't going to comfort him with a lie. He went upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen and washed the same coffee mug twice before realizing what I was doing. We barely spoke for the rest of the night. 2 days later, Rachel called with something else. During the exchange of records, her office had received older text messages between Nicole and Brad. One of them explained a lot. Brad had written, "Your dad won't take this public. He'd rather eat the loss than tell everybody his own daughter took money." Nicole's response was shorter. "He always forgives me." Frank read those words at Rachel's office. Then he read them again. I watched something change in his face. Not anger, exactly. Recognition. For years, whenever Nicole got herself into trouble, Frank helped. When she ran up credit card debt in her 20s, he helped. When she needed money after her divorce from her first husband, he helped. When Brad's business nearly folded, Frank loaned them $85,000. Nicole and Brad hadn't necessarily believed their tracks were perfect. They believed it didn't matter. Frank would never embarrass his daughter publicly. He would swallow the loss, keep the family peace, protect Nicole from the consequences. Frank placed the paper back on Rachel's desk. That's what they got wrong. It was the first time since the petition arrived that he sounded like himself. Still getting his confidence back took more than one good sentence. Frank had stopped going to his Thursday breakfast with the men he used to work with. He claimed he wasn't hungry. I knew better. He thought everyone had heard about the guardianship case. One Thursday morning, I dropped his shoes beside his recliner. "Get dressed." He looked over his reading glasses. "Why, we're going to Bob Evans. I'm not hungry." "Good. Their portions are too big anyway." He stared at me. "Is this part of my rehabilitation?" "Yes, biscuits and public exposure. That got a laugh." So we went. And you know what happened? Nothing. Nobody asked Frank what year it was. Nobody tested his memory. His old foreman complained about property taxes. Another guy argued about the Colts. Somebody spent 10 minutes explaining why his new hearing aids were supposedly ruining his life. Frank sat there drinking bad coffee and being treated like an ordinary 66-year-old man. It did more for him than I expected. After that, he made a decision about his estate. Not an angry one. Nicole wasn't completely disinherited. The grandchildren's education trusts stayed intact under an independent trustee. I remained protected in the house. Nicole would never again have authority over Frank's finances, and any eventual share she received would account for money proven to have been improperly taken. Brad received nothing. "My grandkids didn't do this," Frank said. That was all. Then Nicole's attorney sent Rachel a settlement proposal. Nicole would withdraw the guardianship petition if Frank removed me from certain financial roles, appointed Nicole to manage his affairs, and agreed not to pursue the disputed transfers. Rachel finished reading and looked across the table. "Well, she said that clears up any remaining mystery." Frank actually laughed. The guardianship hearing was set for the Hamilton County Government and Judicial Center in Noblesville. The night before, Frank laid out a new sport coat. The next morning, his fingers were stiff, so I helped with one cuff. He looked embarrassed. "I didn't mention it. She thinks getting old made me easy," he said. "What are you going to do about it?" Frank reached for his cane. "Show up." And that was exactly what Nicole wasn't expecting. Nicole was already inside the courtroom when we arrived. She had Brad beside her, and 3 relatives sitting behind them, including Susan's sister, the same woman who'd avoided me at Kroger. I understood why they were there. Nicole had spent weeks telling people the same story. Her father was declining, his second wife controlled him, and she was only trying to protect him. Then Frank walked in with his cane. not looking 20 years younger. Not pretending his knee didn't hurt. Just Frank. Nicole looked at him, then quickly looked away. Her attorney started with Frank's health, the hospitalization, the knee replacement, the medication, the missed cardiology appointment. Even the shopping cart corral at CVS made another appearance. Frank answered without trying to make himself look perfect. Yes, I forgot the appointment. Yes, Elaine drives more than I do. Yes, sometimes I walk into a room and forget why I went in there. Nicole's attorney glanced toward the judge. Frank added, "My knees are bad. My hearing isn't what it used to be. None of that means my daughter owns me." I saw Rachel hide the smallest smile. Then came the document I'd been dreading. Nicole's attorney produced the financial authorization. He walked Frank through it carefully. "That is your signature, yes, and you voluntarily gave your daughter authority to handle financial matters, certain financial matters. But you trusted her." Frank looked at Nicole. "I did." For a few minutes I felt the case sliding away from us. The paper was real. Frank had signed it. Nobody could change that. Then Rachel stood. She didn't dispute a single word. "Yes," she said. "Mr. Mercer trusted his daughter." She asked Nicole whether the authorization allowed her to pay Frank's medical expenses. Nicole said yes. Household bills? Yes. Move funds between Frank's accounts for his benefit? Yes. Then Rachel changed direction. "Where does it authorize you to transfer his money into your husband's business?" Nicole hesitated. "It gave me financial authority." "That wasn't my question." Silence. Rachel asked about payments toward Nicole and Brad's credit card. Then money connected to improvements on their house. Then the withdrawals that had nothing to do with Frank's medical care or household expenses. Nicole's attorney objected to parts of it, and the judge kept Rachel focused. That actually made the whole thing feel more serious. No dramatic speeches, just numbers and documents. Rachel didn't claim we could prove every dollar either. About $175,000 could be connected with reasonable confidence to transactions outside the purpose Frank had authorized. Another $12,000 or so had moved through cash withdrawals and other activity that was too muddy to pin down cleanly. I was glad she admitted that. The truth wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. Then Frank described the phone call. He told the judge exactly what he'd heard Nicole say that Tuesday morning. "My dad died last night. He left everything to me." "You get nothing." Nicole shook her head. I was confused. I thought he was dead. Frank looked at her. "You thought I was dead? You weren't confused about what you wanted afterward." That was the first moment Nicole started to lose her composure. She insisted Brad had handled many of the transactions. Brad turned toward her. "You knew what we were doing. I knew what you told me. You said your dad wouldn't notice half of it." Nicole's face changed. Brad shut up. Nobody needed to explain what had just happened. Even Brad seemed to realize it about 2 seconds too late. The judge called for order. After that, the room felt different. Near the end, Frank was allowed to speak about his wishes and his relationship with Nicole. He rested both hands on the handle of his cane. "You thought I was weak because I got old," he said. Nicole started crying. Frank didn't raise his voice. "I know I'm slower. Elaine drives when I don't feel steady. She helps me with things I used to do myself. Sometimes I forget names. Sometimes my knee hurts so badly I don't want to leave the house." He paused. "Needing help from my wife doesn't make me my daughter's property." Nicole wiped her face. Frank looked down for a second before continuing. "The money hurt. These court papers hurt. But that wasn't the worst part." He looked directly at her. "The worst part was hearing how happy you sounded when you thought I was dead. Nobody moved. I'd been angry with Nicole for weeks. In that moment, I wasn't. I just felt terribly sad for Frank." The guardianship petition failed. There was no movie-style arrest afterward. Nobody put Brad in handcuffs outside the courtroom. Rachel explained that the disputed money was a separate matter. "The guardianship case is over," she told us. "The money isn't. That was good enough." Outside the courthouse, Nicole caught up with me. Frank and Rachel were several steps ahead. "You turned him against me," Nicole said. I looked at her. There were 100 cruel things I could have said. I didn't need any of them. Nicole, your father was sitting beside me when you celebrated his death. I didn't have to turn him against anybody. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Frank came through the doors behind us, leaning a little heavier on his cane than he had that morning. I went to him. You okay? He exhaled, tired. Then he glanced back at the courthouse. For a dead man, I think I did pretty well. I laughed. So did he. And after weeks of doctors, lawyers, accusations, and people deciding what Frank could or couldn't do, we walked to our truck at exactly his pace. Nobody hurried him. Winning in court didn't fix our family. I think that surprised Frank. For months, Nicole barely spoke to him. No Sunday calls, no random pictures of the grandkids. At Thanksgiving, she sent a 2-line text instead of coming over. Frank pretended it didn't bother him. I knew better. One night, I found him sitting at the kitchen table after midnight, turning his phone over in his hands. Maybe I should have just let the money go, he said. And the guardianship, he didn't answer. That wasn't about money, Frank. I know. You can forgive somebody without handing them the keys again? He nodded, but slowly. That was the hard part. Nobody tells you about boundaries. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel good. Sometimes it just hurts differently. The financial dispute took months to settle. We never recovered every dollar. Rachel's office could document roughly $175,000 well enough to pursue, but some cash withdrawals remained too murky. In the end, Nicole agreed to repay a substantial portion over time rather than keep fighting. Frank accepted it. Brad's contracting company didn't survive the following year. Not because Frank destroyed it. That distinction mattered to me. Frank simply stopped rescuing them. Brad eventually took a salaried construction management job. Nicole went back to full-time work. They sold their oversized house and moved into a smaller place. For years, whenever Nicole fell, Frank had quietly put a cushion underneath her. This time he stepped back. Gravity did the rest. He never punished the grandchildren. Their education trusts remained exactly where they were, except Frank appointed an independent trustee to manage them. My grandkids didn't do this, he reminded me. A few months later, his oldest granddaughter mailed him a birthday card. Nothing expensive, just a card with crooked handwriting inside, "Happy birthday, Grandpa. I love you." Frank read it at the kitchen counter. Then he put it on the refrigerator with a magnet from our old trip to Gatlinburg. He never mentioned the settlement that day. The card mattered more. Life got ordinary again, which was exactly what we needed. Frank started cardiac rehab and complained about it with impressive consistency. He lost 12 pounds over several months. His knee still hurt. He still got lightheaded occasionally if he stood too fast. And yes, sometimes I still helped him with those compression socks. I wasn't exactly aging backward myself. Years of work, menopause stress, and taking care of other people had changed my body too. There was a time when I looked at old photographs and wondered where that slimmer woman had gone. Eventually, I stopped asking. She hadn't gone anywhere. She had simply lived another 15 years. About 8 months after the hearing, Nicole asked Frank to meet her for coffee. Alone. I told him to go. When he came home, I didn't ask questions right away. He hung his jacket up, poured himself water, and finally sat across from me. Well, she apologized. I waited. Good apology. He made a face. Started out terrible. I laughed. Nicole blamed Brad at first, then debt, stress, her fear after losing her mother, her resentment toward me. But eventually she said something honest. I started thinking of what you had as something that was already mine. Frank told me he sat there for a while before answering. Then he said, "You started inheriting me before I was gone." That was the sentence Nicole finally seemed to understand. Frank didn't restore her access to his accounts. She didn't become his power of attorney. There were no dramatic hugs and promises that everything would be the way it used to be. It couldn't be. But they started talking again. Carefully. Sometimes forgiveness is a door you open 6 inches instead of throwing it wide. That was enough. One Saturday morning, months later, Frank and I were sitting at the same kitchen table where this whole mess had started. His pill organizer was beside the napkin holder. I was drinking coffee. Frank was buttering toast. Then my phone rang. We both looked at it. Frank pointed his butter knife toward me. You answer it. Why, last time we got a call before breakfast, I found out I was dead. I smiled. Technically, I answered that call too. He thought about it, then nodded. See, memory's still good. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. And strangely enough, that ordinary morning felt more like winning than the courthouse ever had. We were older, slower, a little heavier, a little more careful going downstairs. But we were still here, still making our own decisions, still sitting at our own table. Aging can take some speed from you. It can change your body and shake your confidence. But it doesn't give anyone, not even family, the right to take your dignity along with it. If you've ever had to set a boundary with someone you still loved, then you probably know why this was harder than it looked. Sometimes protecting yourself and loving someone have to exist at the same time. Thanks for listening.